Good afternoon and greetings from the Library of Congress. Thank you for joining us today. I'm Brent Yakabuchi, Acting Director of the Kluge Center. This afternoon's program is being recorded for distribution on the Kluge Center website, as well as our iTunes and YouTube channels. The Kluge Center was founded in 2000 thanks to a generous donation by philanthropist John W. Kluge. The center is a vibrant community for scholarship on Capitol Hill. We bring together scholars and researchers from around the world to use the library's vast resources and to interact with policymakers and the public. We also administer the Kluge Prize for Achievement in the Study of Humanity, which will be awarded this summer. Today, I have the pleasure of talking with Dr. Alda Benjamen, Abimalik bin Yusuf, Professor, a Faculty Fellow in Assyrian History at the University of California, Berkeley, and a former Kluge Fellow, about her book, Assyrians in Modern Iraq, Negotiating Political and Cultural Space, which was published in 2022 by Cambridge University Press. Assyrians in Modern Iraq discusses how Assyrians define themselves religiously, culturally, and politically in Iraq, focusing on the 1950s to 1980s, including their relationship with the state and the Iraqi opposition. Thank you, Dr. Benjamen, for joining us.
Hello.
Sorry, thank you.
Hello, and thank you for inviting me to talk to you about my book, which I completed really important segments of at the Library of Congress as a Kluge Fellow. So it's a real honor to join you.
Thank you. So to start off, could you tell us what led you to write the book?
Sure. So it's based on my dissertation, my PhD dissertation, and really some earlier master's thesis work that I did in the country. But mainly, I was interested in the history of Iraq, studying the country in the 20th century, in the modern period. And I saw that there was a lack of scholarship on the period that I cover and the community as well. So in general, we know less about provincial history, and the Assyrians are mostly a provincial community residing in the northern provinces in general, at least until the first half of the 20th century. We know less about the community from the period and the approach that I used to study them. I wanted to include sources that were less Western British sort of focused, or from the perspective of the British, and include primary sources that dealt with the history of the country, produced in Iraq and by these communities. I used Arabic and Aramaic together. Assyrians are generally discussed within sort of religious or linguistic lenses, through these lenses, which are very important, but we know less about their secular engagements in urban and rural centers and their involvement with other groups. We know, of course, that communities are not monolithic and the Assyrians are not. So I was interested in telling this sorts of history. And also, the period that I cover, mostly focusing on the 60s to the 1980s, is a period that is not often discussed as much in Iraq or on scholarship discussing the country, because we know we have less sources from that period, and there's been more interest in the period, the ascendancy of Saddam Hussein, the Iran-Iraq war, the US invasion, and so on. So the late 80s and 90s and onwards are generally covered. So it's a period that's not as discussed. The provincial history is important, minorities and marginalized communities, and the history of the left, radical movements, which the book provides an important aspect of Iraqi leftist movements and how various groups fit within that sort of picture.
So can you tell us a bit more about the history of Assyrians in Iraq and in the region?
Sure. So I focus on the modern period, but this community is a historic community. It's native to northern Mesopotamia, so Iraq and parts of neighboring countries as well. They belong. It's a Christian community. They belong to churches that follow the Syriac Christian traditions. They speak an Aramaic that is modern Aramaic, but it's influenced by Akkadian, particularly when it comes to rural lingua and such. And the period that my book covers, the 1960s to the 1980s, or the second half of the 20th century, Assyrians begin migrating from their towns and villages in the north and to urban centers for a variety of reasons, but they're moving to these larger Iraqi cities, often in terms of in search of better employment opportunities and these modern professions that are now, open and available in primarily in the expanding oil industry, but also transportation or for better educational opportunities. And within these urban centers, larger urban centers, they are given their socioeconomic status as recent urbanized communities, similar to any migrant community that you can think of in the world. They are but particularly in the region, they are drawn to these urban politics, mostly leftist, leftist intellectual and political movements that allow the community to emerge from the peripheries and engage with other Iraqis who share a similar socioeconomic background with them, with the Assyrians, and that gives them agency. So they're able to discard, even temporarily, but it's important, I think, to discuss and research their minoritized status, their marginalizations, by engaging with these other groups and forming strategic alliances with the opposition, as I said, particularly the left, and agitating and joining unions and such at particular times. Periods in the early 70s, especially, they're able to negotiate also with the state, which is the Iraqi state at this time, especially under the Baʿthists, which come to power in 1968. They're able to negotiate with them because, given the position of Assyrians within the Iraqi opposition, which is troublesome for the state, and also because the state, it has a growing sort of more power, more finances, given the modernization project they're involved in, and oil money. So, it's given these strategic alliances, they find room to maneuver as individuals and as a community, and often are able to advance issues that are of benefit not only to them, but to the whole community as large.
So can you talk a little bit more about how Assyrians did define themselves as a group, and then how they differentiated themselves culturally, politically, religiously, linguistically?
Yeah, that's a very, very good question. So I talked to you about the community, how they define in terms of, language, history, and briefly, but the way I talk about the community in this particular book, and it's a little bit different from how they are depicted in many works, which look at them only as sort of a Christian, look at the Iraqi Christians in general, or those who adhere to Syriac Christian faith as being adhering to one of a handful Syriac churches with no conceptions of ethnic identity at any point. The communities usually, and there's many good works that are changing this perspective now, but usually they're not studied. Their identity is not sort of understood within a historical framework that changes, that you can take account for the development, especially in the modern period, the 19th and 20th century. So oftentimes we look at their divisions, denominational divisions, as being primordial, right? Religious denominations to be static, and these communities to be governed within particular religious institutions that are rigid, right? But in the urban and political spaces that I explore in my book, I see that Assyrians were able to sort of reach beyond the sectarian divisions by living in these, urban neighborhoods by agitating in labor unions and political parties, and cooperating as intellectuals in the clubs that they come to form, and newspapers, particularly after the passage of Law 251, which gives them cultural rights. So, and also, not just politically or, from these secular sort of lenses, but also if you just look at these communities and families, socially, they intermarry. They usually live in these neighborhoods built by the oil companies, for instance, the IPC, Iraq Petroleum Company in Kirkuk. They live as neighbors. These recently urbanized communities, they marry across denominational lines. They speak out, they develop a koina, which naturally develops in some of these urban centers of the Aramaic, Eastern Aramaic language, and they mingle together. So, these kinds of interactions are very evident in the intellectual amongst the intellectuals, looking at their writings, looking at their what they produce, the editorial boards that they form, and they're important, because also the state, when they passed the law 251, I just mentioned, granting cultural rights, they also collectively designate the community as the speakers of the Syriac language officially. Given, so it basically tells you the government also takes note of their shared heritage. So, and this is not to say that interdenominational divisions within the Syriac Christian churches are not important. They are, and they're not fully eradicated. And sometimes there's internal divisions, and oftentimes, or sometimes, let's say, also the government or various groups utilize these divisions and exacerbating them. Ba'athist policies, we see records and clear sort of depictions of that in the Ba'athist records that I review and look at them. But, understanding, I come back to communities not being monolithic, understanding these communities as only being sort of belonging to particular denominational lines obscures a lot of the complexities that they existed within these communities. And it also, it basically does not allow you to look at anything else. So I argue that there are dividing lines also between those who live in the villages, those who have been urbanized, those who speak the Aramaic language, or it's sometimes referred to as Syriac, those who do not, and those who belong to different ideological camps. So, your political orientation, where you see yourself, also will draw you to other individuals. So that also becomes a dividing line, which should not be ignored. And also, of course, your socioeconomic status, your educational background, all these can be dividing lines for a community.
It's really great. It's fascinating. So can you tell us more about how Assyrians were able to develop political power? I mean, as you talk about in the book, mainly in opposition, first with the Kurdish uprising, and then later with the Kurdish Democratic Party and the Iraqi Communist Party in opposition to the Baʿth Party?
Right. You ask very good questions, Brent. You can think about, the book is divided chronologically and also thematically. So I cover each decade. There's 2 chapters focusing on the 60s, 2 on the 70s, and then concluding with the 80s. So this chronology follows also thematic lines. The community at this time, when I start the period that I start with, does not have any its own autonomous political groups. They have been disbanded, they have been destroyed following, I don't focus on this much in the book. It comes up in the introduction, the genocide, the World War I period. There's a Simel massacre in the 1930s. This is before the period I cover, but it's an important period. Memory is important. It comes up in their works. But to answer your question, those political movements that existed before have been destroyed. So the community, it takes until the 1970s, late 1970s, to reestablish an autonomous Assyrian political movement. So at this time, they are drawn, as I said, to various political groups in the opposition and the left, and it really depends. And it's one of the reasons, or some of the reasons include their location. their concentration in the north, where the northern Iraqi opposition, led mostly by the Kurdish Democratic Party, which is coalescing at this time, is formed or present, right? Their recent urbanization, so this is mostly in provincial areas. In rural centers, their recent urbanization and their socioeconomic status determines really their involvement in urban politics, in unions. They're unhappy with the treatment of the British and the oil company, which at this time is controlled by international actors, and how they treat Iraqi employees, workers mainly. So of course their socioeconomic status drives them to urban politics and unionization and agitation within what becomes eventually, from the unions, some of them will also join the Communist Party or will be affiliated given their sort of positionality. But also their distrust. I think their distrust of the Iraqi government. The Qasim government, they're closer to, of course, but other governments, especially with the coming of the Baʿth, the persecution in terms of executions of political leaders. This is in the 80s, the displacement of villagers, Assyrian villagers, the destruction of Assyrian villagers, along with Kurdish ones, and the state becoming more authoritarian. And even when there's less exclusion, less coercive measures that are used, the Assyrians are excluded in different ways, or certain aspects of their identity is not allowed to sort of to be practiced. So this also becomes another reason why they're attracted to the opposition and which groups that they belong to.
So in the book, you talk about there are many reasons for this, including persecution, but the Assyrians have moved fluidly across national borders. Can you talk about how that migration has affected how Assyrians define themselves?
Yeah, that's a very good question, and one that's a bit complicated. So to answer you, there are existing networks that existed for a long time, religious networks, right? That in the northern region, especially in northern Mesopotamia, before these borders were drawn, people moved back and forth. It happened for a variety of reasons. There could be a celebration of a particular saint's day, where with that celebration, there could be a market that is also sort of established. So, there's cultural, religious, and economic reasons why people went back and forth. Religious figures went back and, there was a network of them that operated in different places. So there's movement. There's always been movement, very similar to the Shia networks in the South, right? However, with the redrawing of the borders after the World War I period and the genocide, those who are displaced become known as refugees. So although this is not the first time, and they don't end up in towns and villages that are completely new to them historically, because these movements did exist, like I mentioned, which is, something that in my second book, I'd like to focus more on. They become defined in a new light, and that stigma of being refugees, which has it has meaning. It has a particular, understanding in the new modern world order, right? That continues to sort of live through the nature of politics and how the community becomes viewed altogether. But going back to the, how does that influence them? These connected networks continue. The borders are porous, and the spaces of the opposition, create even spaces that the state cannot control. So there is movements. The transnational nature of the community allows the Assyrians to be useful, even more so, to the opposition, because through, for instance, the Assyrians in Iran, who are themselves negotiating within the Iranian sort of political space and have a relationship with the monarchy. This is before the toppling of the monarchy. And Iran is funding the Iraqi opposition. So the Assyrians, of course, are benefiting from the transnational nature of the community. At the same time, the diasporic nature of the community, those who are now present in the West, whether in Europe or in North America, they are beneficial to their community members living in Iraq when there is persecution, or to the political groups that are affiliated with the Assyrians in advocating on behalf of their community and the movements along with them when there is human rights abuses and such. So the influence of those groups are felt. But really, I mean, so the Assyrians understand themselves locally, regionally, within the creation of the modern state and urbanization, also nationally as Iraqis, so they're patriotic Iraqis as well, and the political movements that reform or are redeveloped in the late 60s and particularly late 70s or early 60s and late 70s, they argue for Assyrian political, cultural, linguistic rights within an Iraq, within a democratic Iraq. So, for instance, the Assyrian democratic movements, true slogans are a free democratic Iraq and the recognition of Assyrian national identity. Why are and in that particular order? So they imagine themselves having rights as an important component of the country, a native component, if Iraq becomes patriotic. So there's different really levels of identities. They think of themselves as this larger nation with transnational and diasporic connections, but internally they also view themselves as Iraqis. And the book really shows the complexity of the Assyrian experiences and the many contradictions that exist. You have pluralistic engagements versus integration, or pluralistic engagements along with integration. Then you have, separation, hierarchy, differences that really continue under successive regimes in the 20th century.
So for part of the time you worked on the book, you were a fellow at the Kluge Center. You also did research at the Iraqi National Archives, as well as with individuals and collectors in Iraqi towns and villages. So can you talk about the sort of resources that were available to you, both here at the library and in Iraq? And if you could also talk about the challenges in, researching a minoritized community, particularly in such an unstable time.
Yes, gladly. The Library of Congress is really one of my favorite spaces. It's wonderful. It was a really great experience. I did research for many years, even as a graduate student and before becoming a fellow. But when I became a fellow at the Kluge Center, I just cannot say enough of how grateful I am for the time I spent there. There's a wealth of knowledge and resources that you will find. Iraqi magazines and newspapers, a lot of monographs in Arabic and in Syriac by Iraqis from that period are all available. And for my period of focus, the second half of the 20th century especially, there's a strong sort of emphasis on that period at the Library of Congress. But also you have a really excellent law library, which the staff there were very helpful to me in aiding me in understanding the more martial court cases that I had. So the first chapter of my book that looks at the Iraqi Communist Party, I base a lot of my research on martial records or police records that I found at the Iraqi National Library and Archives, which was really a wonderful find. The library had experienced like a lot of cultural centers and institutions in the country, it was targeted. It was, a lot of its material was destroyed. So, but when I was the first scholar from the U.S. to visit in a long time, I was generously helped by the staff at the Iraqi National Library and Archives, and was able to find these police records, which we thought did not exist, but you know, we were able to locate them and use them. So at the law library, the Library of Congress, you know, these were very specific cases covering 1963, when martial law was put in place and these court martials were tried. So I needed to understand the context, I needed to understand the background, and all of that was available there. But really, the Library of Congress was wonderful in the networks and the other fellows that we have formed friendships, and you know, they've become my colleagues, and we exchange works with each other, and our chapters and such. So it was very beneficial in a variety of different ways. Going back to Iraq, doing research in Iraq, at the time I was doing research, so the gist of my research for the PhD began in 2011. That was a difficult period, a challenging period for the country. There was a lot of changes happening politically. There was instability, but you know, the staff at these various libraries were very welcoming. They went out of their way to help me find sources that I needed. There was difficulty on my part finding a lot of the material, because I wanted to tell a different story. I did not want to rely on, you know, British and Western sources. I wanted to add new material because I really wanted to give Iraqis and the Assyrian community a voice, to give a different perspective. So it was important for me to, you know, complement different sorts of sources, you know, the Baʻthist archives, both at the Hoover Institution at the Stanford Library. They were at that time there. They have returned to the country now in physical format. Digitally, they're still there. Also, the Assyrian Democratic Movement in Baghdad had archives pertaining to the Assyrian community, the Christian community in general. You know, and then private collectors, intellectuals that were active in the 1970s who had a lot of these magazines, and the smaller libraries, and all these people, really, they were great. I've included music, I've included oral histories, because in particular, when it comes to both rural communities and women, sometimes you don't find their voices. You cannot really give them any agency if you're just looking at textual production. If you want, you know, so, you know, particular chapters have a lot of oral histories and such sources. So yeah, it was really rewarding, challenging at times, but very rewarding. And I'm grateful for all the people who have opened up their homes and libraries to me, and the Library of Congress, of course, the Kluge Center, very grateful.
So could you tell us a little more about the role those oral accounts played in your research and in writing the book?
Yes. So in terms of oral histories, of course, my project was approved by IRB, Institutional Review Board, and I do not use people's names. Although some people want me to use their names, but for their own safety, and given some immigration policies and such in the US, and where they might end up one day, given the, you know, the instability in the country and some of the violence these members have faced, I did not use any names, but it was again rewarding and challenging in different ways, right? I mean, when you're doing oral histories, I think there's a lot at play. There's power relations at play. Women and gender issues become, you know, age, the socioeconomics, all these things you have to think about and really deconstruct how people share their stories. But I've tried my best to find the right people, really give them a voice in my book, highlight their stories in a way that I hope if they get a chance to read the book, hopefully the book will be available in different languages sometime in the future, that they would be happy with what I've put together. It was the challenging aspect. I mean, it's not just in addition to what I shared with you, I think also sometimes having asking questions and having people live through certain periods of their lives that might have been very difficult, but also they sometimes enjoy talking about some of these experiences or their time in militias, their activism and such, and it varied from group to group, the older generation versus those born in the 1950s, women, but it allows me to add to the complexities of the stories that I share. And I think it's an important aspect. I really think when you're dealing with marginalized communities or minorities in general, or rural communities, or women, sometimes when you can't find your voices, you really need to go the extra mile and find and collect these stories and complement what you're doing. So I have archival sources, the government's perspective, the publications of intellectuals, and there's a hierarchy when you talk about intellectuals, Iraqi intellectuals, the Assyrian community, and also the oral accounts, which I think are very important, along with music. I think for a community like the Assyrians, and you can say also the Kurds, where they might not have learned how to read and write in their language, but they are, it is their language. It's a language that they're most comfortable with, but they were not allowed to standardize it at various periods or learn it in school settings. Being able to listen to music, produce music, whether it's orally sort of a form of intangible heritage, or if it's modernized in the form of a cassette tape, those are also important aspects in my book that come out through different chapters.
So you've talked about women, and in the book, you present the story of Margaret George, the first female Peshmerga, and as you note, an overly romanticized figure in some circles. You also talk about Josephine Warda, who was active with the Iraqi Women's League in the 1960s and the establishment of the Assyrian Women's Union in the 1990s. Can you talk some more about the role of Assyrian women during this time?
Sure. Yeah, so you mentioned some very prominent women that led non-conventional lives, like especially Margaret George, being a militia female fighter, quite good at it as well, who led men in battle. These women find agency, and the Assyrian Women's Union as well, mostly in the contested spaces that were temporarily available to them and carved out by the opposition. So, and they also, like you mentioned, they come from different periods. So they represent different chronological periods, urban versus rural spaces. You can place Margaret George in the rural, Josephine Warda in more urban, Kirkuk, and also ideological camps. They're affiliated with different groups. So Margaret George, as you stated, she's involved in the Kurdish uprising. She's part of the Kurdistan Democratic Movement. Josephine Warda is the chair, the director of the branch, president rather, of the Iraq Women's League, which is in Kirkuk, which is an affiliate of the Communist Party. And then in the 90s, you have the Assyrian Women's Union, who are affiliated. I mean, it's they are created in the safe haven that becomes the Kurdistan regional government, and they are affiliated with nationalist groups, particularly the Assyrian Democratic Movement. So, you could say that their agency and marginalization to a large extent is connected to the political and ideological sort of groups that they're affiliated with. Josephine Warda's activism, she's basically tried for causing chaos in her community. Her case is really important. I mean, when we talk about women in Iraq, we have works based on various accounts that show us how women were very active and had a real engagement in politics and the public spaces that existed. And she fits within that sort of mold of the 1960s. her case is quite interesting because it's based fully on police records. She has a testimony, but everything we know about her comes from somebody who wrote and took these testimonies, right, in a criminal investigation that was going on. It's quite lengthy, so we learn a lot about her. She's a young woman, mother of three young children, is married, and she's tried because of her activism with the Iraqi Women's League, and sentenced for 1 year. But her case is also amenable to an ethno-sectarian sort of analysis in the context, in this particular moment of violence, of the chaotic tide of revolutionary Iraq. And she basically spends a year in prison. What's really interesting about her case, which is different from the other cases of mostly men that I cover in that chapter, and that I was able to find, most of the convicted were men, is the gendered tone characterizing the testimonies of witnesses and of Warda herself. So gender really complicates, adds another dimension to judicial institutions of 1963, that particular period. Margaret is a warrior. I mean, she's really, there needs to be, she's a respected symbol of resistance. There's all these pictures of her, like you said, she's romanticized. She's 21 or 20-year-old Assyrian woman from the village of Barwar, who joins the opposition, becoming an iconic figure. She exists in a hierarchical space of the opposition, and she finds empowerment within it, like the Assyrian community to which she belongs, right? So, and as a result of this sort of contested space of the opposition, she's allowed to operate outside of her gender restraints. But her life and her death, her story, it's very contested. We don't know anything from her own account. We don't have any letters. People I've interviewed says she wrote very well, but do you have that letter? No, I had to destroy it because of fear, right? And maybe the Library of Congress one day will find some of her material, but maybe a memoir that she wrote. But as far as I know, she did not leave anything behind. So, we learn about her from the various different groups that try to sort of control her memory. And it's a controversial, there's a lot of sort of involved in how she's presented, and the struggles that women faced within these spaces. They found agency with them, but also at the same time being able to sort of find agency, but there were struggles. These were spaces that were hierarchical, right, and patriarchal at the same time. The Assyrian Women's Union is formed in 1992 in northern Iraq, right? And it continues to be a very active group. In the book, my interviews with them, oral interviews, are based on interviews I did in 2007, 2008 or so, but I continue to be in touch with them. And they have many members, branches in various cities and villages, and they are geared towards modernization, allowing women to go back to work. For instance, they will have a lot of daycare centers that would help women out, development, educational, political participation, they have strategically in the past continue to do so, but in the past they aligned themselves with the Assyrian Democratic Movement, and in the process they were able to have two presidents gain ministerial positions in the central government and the Kurdistan regional government. So again, these affiliations that these women have with their political groups, with certain political groups, can be beneficial, but then when those political groups are either persecuted or lose their standing, sometimes these women will also feel the consequences. So this is what I can tell you about them, and it's an important question. I think we ignore sometimes the importance of women within these movements and how we can critically think about them and discuss them in a non-romanticized way, you know, I mean, giving them agency, but really understanding the concerns and the context that shape their sort of interactions.
This is all just fascinating. So can you talk about the role of language? I mean, language plays an important facet in any group's identity. How did the teaching of Aramaic or lack thereof affect Assyrians' political and cultural fortunes?
Yeah, so I spend one of the chapters that deals with the 1970s. I mean, language comes throughout, but one chapter, I have two chapters on the 70s, one from the perspective of the state that looks at Baʿth records, and then another one from the perspective of the community that looks at their publications, newspapers and such that were enabled by Law 251. So language is a unifier across the denominational and socioeconomic sort of and regional lines for the community. Language is a crucial element, if not the most important element or aspect of their culture and identity, which allows them to thread through various past, you know, histories, you know, the community's Mesopotamian heritage, more ancient, the medieval Christian Syriac past, and the modern traditions that are continuing on into the present. Language really in its written and oral format has been valued, preserved, elevated by intellectuals, and all segments of the community, really, not just intellectuals, not just religious figures, all segments of the community throughout the centuries. So, you know, efforts of revival, standardization, preservation of this language, which today is endangered, by the way. The Aramaic language, according to UNESCO, is an endangered language, which is really problematic and concerning, especially, you know, with displacement, you lose a lot, not just, you know, you lose the intangible, especially the oral aspect of the culture, something that the Yazidi community is also facing, unfortunately, in Iraq. So you know, being enabled in the period that I study by Law 251, the intellectuals, the editors, the writers of these magazines were promised these cultural rights, and you could you see the importance of language for them, and they make, there's a lot of articles connecting the language to the identity, and this intellectual movement, this cultural renaissance, does lead to a class or a segment of the community that's born in a particular sort of decade, the 1950s, educated in these modern institutions, living in these urban centers, that are attending these activities as teenagers in the 70s. The various cultural groups that have received a space at least to operate, but some support from the government, the Iraqi government. You see these, you know, these, and sometimes you run across their names, or you see their pictures in some of the group images used in these magazines for classes that they're teaching, or social events that they're hosting. Some of these figures become the next generation, the political activists of the next generation. So the political groups that form, a lot of them, especially from the late 1970s, were men and women born in the 1950s, influenced by this revival as teenagers. And so we see how the cultural revival, the linguistic revival, has also an impact on the development of the political aspiration of the community. And as part of Law 251, they were also supposed to be able to teach the language in school settings where, in areas where the community had a majority. This never materialized under the Baʿthis, but we see that those who continue under the oppositional space that becomes the Kurdistan Regional Government in 1991, the Assyrian activists, the Assyrian intellectuals, the Assyrian political actors, particularly the Assyrian Democratic Movement, all these groups come together, and one of the most important sort of outcomes is them pushing for having public schools that teach in the language fully, or at least a few certain subjects, and they succeed in doing that. So you can argue that those intellectuals that were foundational in the 1970s, it takes them about 20, 30 years to one of the first, important policies that they push for in the new sort of regional government is to have schools. So again, the importance of language continues.
Thank you for that. So we have some questions from the audience as well, if you'd like to go to some of them. I think we have some good questions here. So what political ideologies and movements have been prominent among Assyrians during the period you study?
So they were attracted to the Communist Party. They were active within the Kurdistan regional government, Kurdistan Democratic Party. So the Iraqi opposition in the north in general, which included the communists and the KDP, and of course our own political parties in general. Some, like other Iraqis, who lived in the center, had to become members of the Baʿth party as well. All Iraqis, regardless of whether they had components of their communities active within the opposition, they had those who were not, and all teachers had to be Ba'athist members, for instance. Some students in high school had to join. There were particular occupations, and the same thing with Assyrians. You do have some members who are quite significant in the Ba'athist party, but they're not really their connections to the community. I mean, they've adopted Arab nationalist ideals, and they're very much part of the system, particularly in the 80s and 90s. So their connections to the community, they're not pushing for anything specific to the community. But those in the other groups that I've mentioned of the opposition, they are. They do have Assyrian interests to some extent, at play. And there's a difference between what time they join. So the period, the chronology, and thematically it has a significance. So when they join a particular party, why do they join it, and so on and so forth.
So another question we have is, what is the relevance to Assyrians today that they have roots in the region going back thousands of years? How does that show itself?
How does it show itself? You mean, what does that mean to the community? Is that?
I think so. I think that's
what does it mean to the community? The community takes pride in it. Language is an important, as I mentioned, connector to the past. They take pride in it. It's used in the symbolism that the community would use in their magazines, in their social clubs and such, and they identify. It's one of the identifiers of the community. So I always say there's, in my opinion, 4 important aspects of the community. Language being very important, the Mesopotamian heritage also being significant, the Syriac Christian heritage also. So it's not just any form of Christianity, but Syriac Christianity in specific, and their cultural traditions, of course. So all of these factors are important. Some of them are suppressed at certain times. Some of them are expressed more often than others. It really, identity for any community, this community included, you really need to think about the historical development, the consequences, what's influencing that particular period. Is the government or external actors have an influence? Are they trying to sort of, all that historically can be traced, and there's a context for.
So what are the challenges that Iraq faces in trying to build a pluralistic society that respects all of its ethno-religious communities?
Right now, there's a lot of challenges, unfortunately. Since the focusing on the more contemporary period, let's say, since 2003, there's been heightened sectarianism since the US invasion, which, along with violence, extremism, corruption, really has left this community, the Assyrians and other marginalized groups, in a very dire situation. their numbers have decreased drastically since 2003, but especially after ISIS or Daesh, after the invasions of their territory, the occupation of their territory, which along with the Yazidis and others, not only did they experience loss of life, humanitarian crisis, displacement and mass displacements, and destruction of their properties and their cultural heritage sites, tangible cultural heritage sites, churches, places of worship, shrines, for the Yazidis, but all, enslavement of women, particularly for the Yazidi community, but and extreme violence but also their intangible heritage that is really, I think, important. As I mentioned, their language is endangered, and a lot of these cultural traditions, the intangible heritage, I think we pay less attention to, and it's more difficult to preserve. You, of course, think about a very ancient structure or a monument that's destroyed, and that's catastrophic. But when it comes to your certain traditions, agricultural knowledge, your oral traditions, all that, when you're displaced, it's difficult for you to pass on that knowledge to future generations. So it's really difficult. It's a challenging time, and there's also contest over their territories by the Kurdistan regional government, the regional government, and the central government of Iraq. That leads to political tension. And it's leading to a lot of sort of it's adding to the tension, the political tension, the presence of militias, politicized sort of security forces and such. So it's challenging. I think the Iraqi government and the regional government as well, if they really are serious about some of their very flowery statements, and some of them perhaps are well-meaning, they need to take serious steps in securing the livelihood of marginalized groups, the Assyrians and others included, protecting them, making sure that demographic, protecting them in various ways, their lands, making sure that there's no sort of the criminal justice system, and all that treats them as equal citizens. I think it's doable. I think Iraqis in general have had multiple, pluralistic moments, and people get along in general. Of course, you cannot ignore the marginalization and the coercion, the persecution that has happened, and people have to be brought to justice, those who have committed crimes. But I think if the governments, both the regional and the central, are more serious about their keeping minorities and pluralistic, sort of creating pluralistic spaces, they can succeed. But these communities have to be have to be given agency and have to be part of the formula to find a positive way where everyone can, belong and survive or coexist.
Certainly. So what would you say has surprised you most that you discovered when you were researching your book?
How generous everyone was with their stories and sources, and how helpful Iraqis are in general, and in just opening up and welcoming you into your homes. Everything beyond that was a surprise, a positive surprise. All the sources that I was able to find and collect, it was really a very just wonderful to get access to the material that I was fortunate to have and entrusted with, and I'm very grateful for it.
So you've touched on this a bit. Have you found that Assyrians, their history and their place in modern Iraq, have been well studied in the past, or is it an area that needs much more scholarly attention?
Oh, I think we can do a lot on the Assyrians. We can some of the a lot of my chapters. I could have written a whole book on them and got more into sort of the detailed aspects of the various engagements. And there's a lot of complexities involved in all these different political groups, these intellectual movements, and how people affiliate, associate. There's a lot that still needs to be studied. I think in general, we know a lot less about provincial Iraqi history, these rural movements, or rural communities in general. So I think we certainly need more people to sort of leave the capitals and expand and learn more languages. You know, I think we either use Arabic, you know, or Farsi, or you know, Turkish, Ottoman Turkish, but there's a lot of minority languages. Of course, in their areas of practice, they're not minorities, or they're the majorities, right? We need to sort of learn these languages and study these communities and these areas, thinking about the multilingualism that really was a reality in a lot of these spaces, and then how the people interacted with each other and what multilingualism enabled. And I think we will find really interesting stories and histories that we can share.
So jumping off from that, you mentioned a second book you're working on. Do you want to talk about that book?
Okay, I just started. I was just in Iraq and returned last month, so this is very new. But I'm interested in doing sort of a history focusing on a bazaar that in the town of Al-Qosh, and that connects the looking at the market, trade, multilingualism, a small town with a very big, important history that connects the Kurdish mountainous region with the Moslawis in Mosul, so Arab Sunni center, and the town itself has a significant Jewish community. So it's looking at Jews, Christians, Muslim interactions, multilingualism, and you know, these interactions can be defined in terms of trade, cultural exchanges, and such. So, but the project is very new, and even my description of it might change in the next few months or years, but I will certainly use the Library of Congress for a lot of my research. In fact, when I was towards the end of my research at the Kluge Center, I was looking up some sources, and I found some wonderful works on this project. So I'll be visiting you soon, hopefully.
Excellent. Well, Dr. Benjamin, thank you so much for your time today. This has been a fantastic discussion. The book really is intriguing, and I'm glad that your time at the Library of Congress was so productive. So
thank you so
very much.
Thank you so much for hosting me.
And thank you all of us for joining us today.